The village of Barifbur lay nestled between hills that breathed mist like an old man with secrets caught in his throat. It was a place carved out of stories, many forgotten, some whispered late at night when the oil lamps flickered for no reason. The forest that hugged the edge of the village was ancient, older than memory, older than language, its roots twisted like gnarled fingers trying to crawl out of the earth. People walked quickly past its boundary even in daylight, for they believed the trees remembered. On this particular evening, the mist rolled in earlier than usual. It was the kind that clung to your skin and slipped beneath your collar, whispering cold nothings against your spine. It moved strangely, too fast, too thick, and it didn't rise, even when the wind picked up. The sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in streaks of purple and fire, but no one noticed the beauty. The villagers' eyes were fixed on the narrow path leading to the burial ground. They carried her in silence. No drums. No songs. No cries of mourning. Asha had always been different. Not disliked, not exactly feared, but always at a distance. She lived on the edge of the village, close enough to be seen, far enough to be separate. She grew herbs others didn't know the names of. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice had a calm that unsettled. Some said she healed the sick, others said she caused the illness in the first place. Either way, they respected her. That is, until she died. Or so they believed. The funeral procession was small. Her body was wrapped in white cloth, clean but unadorned. No flowers were tucked into the folds. No incense burned. The priest muttered hurried prayers under his breath, his hands trembling slightly as he sprinkled soil over the cloth. Asha's face was covered, but someone swore her lips moved just before the final wrap, only a twitch, maybe the nerves, maybe nothing at all. It should have been a proper ceremony. But dusk was falling, and the elders insisted it be done before night fully arrived. An old rule, never questioned, do not bury the marked ones after dark. No one remembered why, only that it had to be done. They didn't even wait for the last of the sun to slip below the hills. The birds had stopped singing. That was the first thing most people noticed, though no one said it aloud. The usual evening chorus had been replaced by silence, heavy and watchful. A wind blew through the trees, sudden and cold, causing several villagers to shiver in unison. It was June, yet the air tasted like January. A lantern went out on its own. Another flickered, then steadied. The priest looked up, then hurried his words. As the final shovelful of dirt landed on the grave, a child standing near the edge of the group tugged at her mother's hand. "She's not gone," the child whispered, staring wide-eyed at the fresh mound of earth. Her mother hushed her quickly and pulled her away, but the girl looked back once more. Asha's name had not yet faded from her lips when the last light of day vanished behind the hill. The villagers turned and walked away, not looking behind them. No one stayed to place a stone or say a prayer. The mist thickened. And somewhere in the distance, the forest sighed. The sun had barely touched the earth when they buried her, but dawn would bring something they could never forget. Asha was always a figure carved out of contrast, gentle hands that soothed fevers and a gaze that could silence a room. She lived at the edge of the village, in a small house of mud and slate roofed with thatch, where wildflowers grew uninvited along the windows and birds nested undisturbed under the eaves. Children used to watch her from the road, daring each other to walk closer to her gate, only to flee giggling if she so much as turned her head. Yet when those same children fell ill or scraped their knees bloody, it was Asha their mothers went to, and never the priest. She was kind, always kind. Quiet, too, but not shy. She spoke with the sort of stillness that demanded listening, her words precise, never wasted. Asha never married, never showed interest in any man or woman. No one ever saw her leave the village. Her needs were few, and she grew most of her own food. She kept goats, 3, each with bells around their necks, and had a black dog who followed her silently, eyes that gleamed in the dark like coals stirred to life. The animal was mute, as far as anyone could tell, but somehow Asha always seemed to know what it wanted. Stories about her had circulated for as long as most people could remember. It was said she had been born during a solar eclipse, her mother dying the very night she came into the world. Midwives claimed she hadn't cried at birth, only opened her eyes wide and stared at the fire as though recognizing something in its dance. The village elder, now long dead, once told the tale of how Asha, still a child, had coaxed a wounded hawk from the forest, wrapped its wing with strips of her own dress, and whispered something no one else could hear. The bird had flown again 3 days later. Another tale claimed she had healed a blind man, Gerhar, the old drunk who wandered from village to village, after touching his eyes and feeding him tea steeped in moonlight. Some believed he faked the blindness. Others swore it was true. Gerhar never spoke of it again. There were less pleasant stories, too. Some said she cursed a man who tried to force his way into her home one night. He was found the next morning babbling in the woods, unable to form words, his hair turned stark white. He left the village and never returned. Another rumor told of Asha sitting in the rain unmoving for an entire night, her eyes closed, as if in deep communion with something no one else could see. Come morning, all the crops in a nearby field had wilted overnight, yet the plants in her garden had bloomed twice over. The villagers never questioned her directly, of course. But the tales remained, passed down like recipes and warnings. They were grateful to her, especially when their children recovered from strange illnesses or when a woman's labor went from deadly to blessed, but there was fear tangled in the gratitude, a superstitious unease that made people leave gifts at her doorstep rather than thank her face to face. A bundle of turmeric, a swatch of cloth, rice soaked in saffron. It was their way of staying safe. Asha never asked for anything. She never turned anyone away. Her death came suddenly. One morning, smoke didn't rise from her chimney. Her goats bleated through the morning without food. When a group of villagers finally dared to check on her, they found her lying in bed, fevered and pale, her breath shallow and her skin burning hot to the touch. She opened her eyes briefly and whispered something none of them could understand, words that sounded more like wind than voice. They brought the priest. He sprinkled ash and muttered prayers. He said it was a spirit fever, an imbalance of energies. Another woman, the village midwife, claimed it was snakebite. But there were no puncture marks. Others thought it might be a curse cast back at her from some broken rule of nature. An old woman, Camley, whose eyes were clouded with age, warned them not to bury her if she passed after sunset. Wait for 3 suns, she croaked. If you put her beneath the earth before her spirit settles, she will not stay. But no one listened to Camley anymore. Her words were dismissed as madness soaked in too much grief from a long-dead husband and children who moved away. That night, Asha's breathing slowed. By morning, she was still. No one cried, but a chill settled in the village that never truly lifted. A few villagers wanted to perform the full rites, prepare her body properly, and wait for the following sunrise. But others insisted she be buried that evening. The forest had been louder than usual. Dogs barked at nothing. One man swore he saw her walking briefly past his window, even though she lay in bed, cold and lifeless. Fear wrapped itself around tradition, squeezing until all that was left was a rushed plan. They would bury her before the sun vanished completely. The priest was uneasy. He flipped through brittle pages of an old book he rarely used. He found no rules for her kind. She wasn't declared a witch, but she wasn't innocent either. She existed outside categories the village understood. They wanted her gone. The burial was agreed upon with more urgency than care. No one dared say it, but they didn't want her staying around, not as memory, not as spirit, not as anything. They didn't speak of love, or legacy, or peace. They spoke only of finishing it. So as dusk bled into darkness, the villagers prepared her body with haste, eyes averted, prayers muttered under their breath. The fear, though unspoken, was thick. Thick enough to shape decisions. Thick enough to bury a woman long before they understood what they were laying to rest. The morning after Asha's burial began like any other in Barifpur, cold, gray, and hushed, but something about the silence wasn't right. It wasn't the sleepy quiet of dawn or the reverent pause of prayer. It was the kind of silence that sits in your throat, heavy, watching. Dinesh, the village potter, was the first to see her. He rose early as always, long before his children stirred, to begin work by the kiln behind his house. The mist was heavier than usual, curling in thick ribbons across the field, trailing fingers along the earth like it was searching for something. He was stacking the first row of pots to dry when he noticed movement near the far edge of the grass, just where the fields gave way to the woods. At first, he thought it was an animal, a dog maybe, or one of Asha's goats. But then it moved closer, and the shape began to form, a figure, walking slowly, almost drifting. The mist clung to her, reluctant to let go, and her feet made no sound as they touched the wet grass. Dinesh squinted through the fog and dropped the bowl he had been carrying. She was barefoot. She was wearing white, the same white cloth they had wrapped her in, not stitched or tied like a sari, but the exact funeral shroud, dirt-stained at the edges. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her hair loose, swaying ever so slightly as she walked. Most terrifying of all were her eyes, wide open, blank, unblinking. Asha. Dinesh stumbled backward and nearly fell over a stack of clay. He didn't scream. He couldn't. His voice had turned to ash in his throat. The figure never turned toward him, never slowed. She just kept walking, silent and pale, toward the forest. The mist seemed to part for her. By the time Dinesh reached the temple square, his face was the color of flour and his words were tumbling out of him like fevered birds. She's walking. I saw her. Asha. She walked into the woods. Within an hour, the entire village buzzed with confusion and rising panic. Some rushed to the burial site, hoping, dreading, to find her grave disturbed. But it wasn't. The mound of earth stood undisturbed, the soil packed firm. No footprints, no signs of digging. Yet Dinesh swore on his mother's soul. He hadn't imagined it. She looked straight through me, he said again and again, trembling. But it was her. The same cloth. Her feet were covered in dirt. And her eyes, by all the gods, her eyes. Soon, others claimed sightings. A woman fetching water said she glimpsed a white figure moving through the banyan trees. A shepherd boy claimed he heard someone singing near the edge of the stream in Asha's voice, low and clear. By noon, the village had divided into warring whispers. Some believed her spirit had returned, unfinished business keeping her tethered to the earth. Others were less kind, calling it a curse, a sign that she hadn't been human to begin with, that maybe Asha had been something else all along, and death had only set it free. Which, one woman muttered, biting her knuckles. No, said another, shaking his head. It's punishment. We buried her wrong. Too fast. We dishonored her. Arguments bloomed in every corner. The priest refused to speak directly of it, retreating to the temple to consult books he hadn't opened in years. The elders called for a village meeting, but no one wanted to stay in one place for long. A few brave souls ventured to the edge of the forest where Dinesh said she disappeared, but found nothing but disturbed grass and cold mist that felt heavier than it should. The trees looked the same, but birds didn't return to their branches, and the dogs howled when the searchers came near. Then someone noticed something even stranger. Asha's house, shuttered and empty the night before, now had its door ajar. When the neighbors approached, they saw the windows were open, as if someone had been airing the place out. Inside, the hearth was cold, but swept clean. A pot of water sat near the edge of the counter. And strangest of all, fresh flowers rested on the sill of the window facing east, bright red hibiscus, still dewy from the morning mist. The villagers stood at the doorway, none daring to step inside. There had been no flowers there yesterday. No one admitted to putting them there. No one even owned a hibiscus plant that bloomed in that shade of red. She's come home, a child whispered, clutching his mother's hand. No, another man hissed. She never left. By sundown, few dared to speak Asha's name aloud. The village, once bound by routine and ritual, now moved like a place holding its breath. Doors were bolted earlier than usual. Chores were left unfinished. The bravest men carried charms in their pockets, and the women hung cloves and lemon strings from their door frames, muttering protection prayers into the dusk. They didn't know what had come back. They didn't know if it was really her. But they knew something was walking. And it wasn't finished yet. The village elders had been silent during the first murmurings of Asha's return. They listened as the younger villagers debated curses, ghosts, and punishment, their faces unreadable, their hands clasped tight with memory. But when word spread about the open house, the fresh flowers, and the second sighting near the well, their silence grew heavier, less like uncertainty, more like reluctant recognition. It was old Daji, the most ancient of them, who finally spoke during a gathering near the banyan tree. His back was bent like a bow long drawn, his voice a rasp that sanded down every word, but the villagers fell quiet when he began. "This is not the first time," he said, his eyes fixed on the ground. "We have forgotten. Chosen to forget. But the earth doesn't. Nor does Dusk." The younger ones shifted, frowning. A few crossed their arms in skepticism. But the older folk didn't flinch. They remembered things their parents had whispered, stories spoken in kitchens and fields, never during festivals or prayers. Daji told them of the dusk buried. A soul buried at the wrong time, when light and dark are in balance, is not settled, he explained. Especially if the body was marked. Especially if the spirit wasn't ready. Dusk is not just a passage of the sun. It's a doorway. And if you force a soul through it too soon, it may find its way back. Others chimed in, slowly at first. Rupa Masai, who rarely spoke since her husband's passing, said her grandmother once mentioned a boy from another village who had died of snakebite. He was buried hastily at twilight because the rains had come early. A week later, his sister claimed to see him sitting on the roof of their hut, staring at the horizon. Nothing ever grew in that field again. The family moved away. These weren't ghost stories shared for thrill. These were fragments of cultural memory, tales so old, so uneasy, they had slipped into silence. Someone brought up the sunbound ones. It was an ancient phrase, barely used, like a worn relic pulled from beneath floorboards. According to the lore, there were certain people whose spirits were tied to the sun, not out of divinity, but out of some bond with light itself. If they were buried when the sun had not fully set, or worse, when the dusk light touched their skin, the soul could refuse to move on. The result wasn't possession, nor haunting in the usual sense. The sunbound did not scream or float or shatter mirrors. They walked. They remembered. And they returned, not as themselves, but not entirely lost either. Something in between. That was when old Boggett, the retired honey seller, told a tale few had heard. Asha's great-grandmother, he began, voice low and brittle, was called Kari. People said she was strange too. Lived near the forest. Spoke to the wind. Birds used to follow her. One night, she died of a fever. But the rains were too strong. They buried her quickly, just as the sun dipped. 2 days later, her footprints appeared on the mud outside her own house. Fresh. Barefoot. No one saw her, not directly, but the trees wouldn't grow on that patch of land again. Her house stood empty for years. And later, her own daughter moved into it. That daughter was Asha's mother. Gasps moved through the crowd like a sudden wind. Most had never heard this. The pieces began to stitch together in their minds, Kari, the footprint ground, the secluded life. It was as though something had always lingered in the bloodline, waiting. The priest, who had avoided most of the conversation, finally stood and addressed the villagers. He had a scroll in his hand, parchment brown with age, ink faded but still legible. There is a term, he said, recorded only in the oldest temple texts. Samkayana, the mirror dusk. A rare sliver of time when the sun and night gaze at each other with equal strength. It happens only a few times a year. Most pass without event. But on these days, the boundary between the worlds is thinner. If a soul is disturbed during Samkayana, it may find its way back before the veil closes. The villagers listened, hushed and pale. He continued, we buried Asha just minutes before true dusk. The exact time of Samkayana. It was not coincidence. It was mistake born of fear. And what happens now? Someone asked. The priest hesitated. The rites were unfinished. No last offerings. No passage prayer. No soul lantern. She was never truly given to the earth. So she returned, to finish what we didn't. A concept began to crystallize in the villagers' minds: the unfinished rites. Asha's burial had been rushed, not only against tradition but against something older, something primal. It wasn't merely about religious ritual, it was about balance. A soul needed guidance, closure. Left unanchored, it became untethered, and then, it wandered. They remembered now that no lamp had been placed in her hands, no whispered blessings for safe passage had been spoken near her ears. The rice was never scattered in the four directions. The dog never circled the grave. None of the protections had been given. "She isn't angry," Rupamasai said softly. "Not yet. She's confused. Calling to be remembered the right way." But others weren't so sure. "She hasn't spoken," muttered one man. "She doesn't blink. Is it still her?" The question hung in the air like smoke. That night, no one slept well. Even those who didn't believe the old stories checked their doors twice, lit an extra dia. Somewhere deep in the woods, a dog barked once, then went silent. The village knew, now, that what walked among them was not simply a spirit. It was a reckoning. And dusk would come again. The village remained gripped in a hush of terror, but 3 people defied it, each drawn by something different: a question, a bond, a feeling too strong to ignore. Ravi, the skeptic, was a schoolteacher by trade and habitually logical by nature. He dismissed most superstitions as stories made to soothe or scare, but even he had to admit that something in the air had shifted. He told himself he went looking for answers, not ghosts. Then there was Mira, the child. She was only 10, sharp-eyed and silent, one of the few who had ever dared talk to Asha without fear. Mira had once brought her a wounded squirrel, and Asha had nursed it back to life. Since the burial, Mira had taken to sitting near the forest's edge at dusk, whispering into the trees. She said she could still hear Asha's voice, not in words, but like humming behind the wind. And finally, there was Dev, older than the other 2, and harder. His face held the wear of grief that hadn't been allowed to speak. Once, long ago, he and Asha had been more than friends. Their love had bloomed quietly in the shadows of tradition, never named, never condemned, but never allowed either. They had parted without drama, each resigned to their solitude. Dev hadn't spoken to her in over a year before her death. And now, he couldn't stop hearing her name. The 3 met at the edge of the village at first light, where the mist hung low and heavy, and the forest still whispered the breath of night. They said little, only nodding at one another. None had told the others exactly why they were going. They didn't need to. It wasn't long before they found the first clue. Footprints, bare and deep, tracked along the earth, except these weren't normal. The grass beneath them had withered, not crushed but browned, like it had been touched by heat. Each step had burned slightly into the ground, searing a path toward the woods. Mira reached down to touch one and hissed, pulling her hand back. "Warm," she said. "Still." They followed the trail deeper. Birds remained unusually quiet. The trees didn't sway, even when the breeze picked up. Twice, they saw animals dart across their path: squirrels, a fox, even a deer, but each one paused, stared at them with too human stillness, and disappeared without a sound. "This forest is watching us," Ravi muttered, though he would later deny saying it. The whispers began just after they reached the old clearing, soft, impossible to place. Not language, not sound, exactly. More like pressure in the ears, and almost thought. Dev stopped walking and turned in a slow circle. "She used to sit here," he said. "This clearing." She said the air here was different. Mira wandered to a fallen tree and found something carved into the bark: symbols, circles, and a shape like the rising sun with a crack through it. Ravi brushed off moss from a nearby stone and uncovered faded chalk markings: spirals, moons, the word again scratched into the rock. It was Dev who found the journal, tucked into the hollow of a tree behind the clearing. Wrapped in oilskin and bound with thread, it had Asha's unmistakable handwriting, looped, deliberate, thoughtful. He opened it slowly, reverently, afraid the pages might fall apart. The entries inside were short, cryptic. I feel the dusk pull tighter each night, she had written a week before her death. Dreams of the same sun, cracked and bleeding. I am being drawn somewhere old. Another page showed rough sketches, faces with hollow eyes, trees bending inward, a woman standing beneath a sky split in half. There was an entry that mentioned Kari, her great-grandmother, and a note, "It begins again. The blood remembers." The last page held only one sentence. "I will walk again, not to haunt, but to remind." Ravi stared at the words for a long time. "She knew," he said softly. "She knew what would happen." Dev's hands tightened around the book. "She didn't want to scare us. She wanted to leave a message. A path." They sat in the clearing for a time, letting the silence wrap around them. Mira pointed at the sky. "Look," she said. A pair of hawks circled above, their flight strangely synchronized. One let out a single cry that echoed longer than it should have. "She's not angry," Mira said. "I don't think she ever was." The three continued deeper, following the signs, markings on trees, arrangements of stones, symbols they couldn't fully understand. The forest seemed to part for them, like it remembered her, too. There was no fear among them anymore, only understanding. Asha hadn't returned as a monster or revenant. She had come back as a message. A thread between the living and the forgotten. As they turned to head back to the village, a gust of wind blew through the trees, strong enough to ripple their clothes and send leaves spiraling. In the rush of it, they heard something, just for a moment. Not a moan, not a cry. A name. Dev. He froze, his eyes wide. But when he turned, there was no one there. Just the sun, rising through the mist. And 3 sets of footprints, 4, briefly, until one faded completely into the forest floor. It began with the temple bell ringing at the wrong hour. At precisely midday, under a cloudless sky, the old bronze bell at the center of Barifbur tolled once, though no hand pulled its rope. Villagers froze mid-step, their eyes darting upward. Children stopped playing, a cart horse reared in panic, and birds that hadn't sung in days, exploded from the trees in sudden flight. Then came the hush. Not fear this time, not confusion. Something was arriving. At the far end of the village, where the path from the forest meets the start of the first houses, Asha walked. In broad daylight. No fog. No mist. No shadows to obscure her now. She was clear, visible, undeniable. She wore the same white burial cloth, though it now clung to her like a second skin, moving subtly in the breeze. Her hair was loose and shining. Her feet were still bare, but no dirt clung to them now. The air around her shimmered, not with heat, but with memory, an unspoken weight of something known. Something returned. People watched from behind door frames and half-closed shutters, unsure if they were seeing a ghost or a woman or both. But Asha didn't drift or hover. She walked, slowly, steadily, like someone who had finally found their way home after a long journey. Her first words came as she passed beneath the neem tree at the village square. She paused, placed a hand against the cracked trunk, and turned to face the small crowd that had begun to gather. "You buried me," she said, softly, "before the moon could rest." A shudder passed through the group, not out of fear, but recognition. It wasn't a threat. It was a correction. A simple truth, spoken with sorrow. Asha's voice was calm, deeper than many remembered, threaded with something older than human breath. When she looked at people, they didn't feel watched, they felt seen. She didn't weep. She didn't rage. She simply walked, pausing before certain homes, certain people. At the well, she looked at Mala, the midwife who had once refused to tend to Asha's mother during her illness, citing unnatural omens. Asha said nothing. But as she stood there, Mala began to cry, slowly, silently, as if remembering something she'd spent years trying to forget. Outside the old tailor's shop, she placed her hand on the wall. The tailor's son, now grown, emerged slowly and collapsed to his knees. He whispered a single word, "Sorry." No one asked why. She knelt before Shanta, an elderly woman who once fed her when Asha was a child and others turned away. Asha smiled. Shanta blinked, stunned, and then, for the first time in years, stood up from her chair without pain. Some villagers followed Asha at a distance, not daring to approach. Others closed their doors tightly and muttered protective prayers. But no harm came. Wherever Asha walked, memories stirred, not just in people, but in the land itself. The old banyan tree near the river suddenly bloomed red flowers from a branch long thought dead. A dried-up stream beside the schoolhouse ran clear again, trickling with water that tasted faintly sweet. Cracks in the walls of homes closed, just slightly, as if some invisible hand had smoothed them over. Still, no one could explain what she was. She breathed, but not like the living. Her footsteps left no sound, yet her gaze echoed in the minds of those she passed. Some felt joy. Others felt the sharp sting of buried guilt. Ravi, the skeptic, finally approached her. "Are you dead?" he asked. "Or something else?" She looked at him, the corners of her mouth turning slightly upward, not a smile, exactly. More like forgiveness. "I was, but not all the way. Not in the ways you measure." "Why come back?" "To finish. To reveal. To remember. And to remind." "Remind us of what?" Asha's eyes glinted in the sunlight. "That time is not a line. That death is not silence. That truth will always rise where it was buried." Ravi nodded, a tear he didn't expect welling in his eye. He had not known her well. But now, he felt as if she knew him. As dusk neared, Asha stood at the center of the village. Not commanding, not demanding. Simply present. The priest stepped forward, holding the scroll he had shown before, his hands shaking. We did wrong," he admitted aloud. "We feared more than we honored. You deserved better." She looked at him kindly. "It is not only me." A hush fell. Many were buried too soon. Many voices quieted before their time. "I walk because I remember them. And now, so will you." That night, the villagers gathered together by the temple flame, an impromptu gathering with no plan, no priestly command. One by one, people began to share stories. Regrets. Kindnesses forgotten. Small sins buried in silence. Losses that had never been grieved aloud. Asha sat among them for a time, listening, her eyes closed, as if hearing more than words. When the final diya was lit, she stood. And without a word, walked back the way she had come, toward the forest, toward the rising hush of night. She did not vanish. She simply became part of it. And in her wake, Barifpur found itself not haunted, but transformed. Where fear had lived, truth now breathed. Where silence reigned, stories flowed. Asha had not returned for vengeance. She had returned as a mirror. And now, the village could not look away. The return of Asha stirred more than awe, it cracked open the heart of Barifpur. And from the fractures spilled fear, fury, reverence, guilt. For a time, the village tried to pretend it was unified. They lit lamps for her. Some placed offerings by the neem tree where she'd first spoken. Children whispered her name with a mix of fear and affection. But within the hush, deeper currents stirred. It began with whispers in the temple courtyard. "This is not natural," muttered Bhima, a stout man who fancied himself the village elder despite being younger than most. "We buried her. She should stay buried. The dead have their place." "Unless we buried her wrong," someone else replied. "Unless it was us who made her walk." And just like that, sides began to form. On one end were those who saw Asha's return as a blessing, a reckoning wrapped in compassion. They said she had shown mercy, had healed more than she harmed, had reminded them of who they used to be. "She came back because we forgot who we were," said Shanta, holding the hand of the youngest orphan boy. "And she brought that memory home. But on the other side stood the fearful, the doctrinal, the hardened. Led by Bhima and supported by the younger priest in training, they spoke of spiritual imbalance, of unnatural forces slipping through cracks in tradition. What walks is not her, the priest warned. It wears her shape. But her soul should be at peace. It cannot be both dead and living. By the third day, the arguments reached the temple doors. Ritualists arrived from neighboring villages, invited in desperation. They came robed and solemn, carrying scrolls and incense, bones of saints, and silver bells. Some claimed she needed reburial, this time with salt, iron, and sacred mantras. Others demanded fire, the old rite reserved for unnatural rebirths. One even suggested sealing her grave with black stone and sealing her name from the village register. And then someone asked the question no one had yet dared speak aloud. What if we check the grave? The next morning, they gathered at the cemetery on the edge of the forest, where the dusk burial had been hastily done days before. Asha had been placed beneath a flowering neem, her grave shallow and hurried. They dug with nervous hands. It didn't take long. There she was, Asha. Her body lay just as they had left it, white dress unmarred by soil, skin unspoiled by decay. Her hands crossed neatly over her chest. Her eyes were open, soft and dark, and unmistakably aware. Several gasped. One man fell to his knees and turned away, muttering protective chants. Mira, the little girl, approached and stood silent at the edge. She's sleeping, Mira whispered. But not like before. She's listening. One of the ritualists placed a hand on the dirt. He yelped and withdrew. It was warm. Not just sun-warmed. Radiant. Like a hearth buried beneath earth. The ground remembers her, he murmured. Arguments resumed. See? She's here and not here. A split. She must be anchored, said one elder. No, countered Shanta. She is not trapped, we are. She walks because we buried her in fear. We broke the law of kindness. Then we must fix it, Bhima said. Fire, salt, stone, whatever it takes. Set her free. And what if she came back to free us? Asked Ravi, stepping forward, voice quieter than most, but clear. You talk of rights. She speaks of truth. This is not a haunting. It's a reflection. Maybe we don't need to banish her. Maybe we need to listen. The priest clutched the scroll tighter, his eyes scanning the gathered faces. We are standing at the edge of old knowledge, he admitted. An old fear. Asha did not appear that night. Nor the next. Her absence became its own kind of presence, heavy, watching, expectant. Meanwhile, her body remained untouched, undisturbed in its earthen cradle. The village could not agree. Some wanted ceremony. Others wanted silence. Some whispered that she must decide for herself, that the grave should be left open until the next dusk. One man planted jasmine around it, unasked. And through it all, the earth stayed warm. Not burning. Not threatening. Just warm, like something still breathing beneath it, waiting for the village to choose not what to do with Asha, but what to do with itself. The night air was thick with expectation as the village of Barivpur gathered once more beneath a sky pricked with stars. Word had spread fast. An ancient rite, long forgotten and nearly lost to time, had been found hidden within the brittle pages of a manuscript tucked away in the temple's neglected archives. The elders called it the burial of the twice risen, a ceremony meant for those souls who had returned from the threshold, whose rest had been disturbed by fear or unfinished rites. The villagers assembled quietly around the temple courtyard, the soft glow of torches flickering against faces etched with worry, hope, and awe. The ritualists prepared their sacred items, bowls of sacred water, bundles of fragrant herbs, woven cloth dyed with crimson from the berries of the nightshade bush, and carefully carved wooden symbols representing the sun, the moon, and the earth. Asha walked among them, her presence calm and steady like a gentle current flowing through the crowd. She was no longer the restless spirit that had appeared in the harsh light of day, nor the unsettling image in the morning mist. This time, she was something closer to peace, a bridge between what was and what could be. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice held the weight of mountains and the softness of dawn. Tonight, she said, we honor the breath between endings and beginnings. The space where life and death dance together. The village priest, a figure both humbled and emboldened by the events of recent days, stepped forward to lead the ceremony. His voice rose in chanting, old words carried across generations, vibrating through the cool night. The crowd joined, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of sound that felt older than the hills surrounding them. Then came the moment that stilled everyone. Asha led the procession toward the edge of the village, where an ancient tree stood sentinel, a towering banyan known as the breath of earth. Its massive roots dug deep into the soil, its wide branches stretched toward the sky as if holding the heavens themselves. This tree was sacred, spoken of in stories as the keeper of souls and the witness to countless cycles of life and death. Asha paused before the tree, her hand resting lightly on its rough bark. She looked back once at the villagers, eyes full of quiet command and forgiveness. This is where I rest, she said. Without hesitation, she lay down beneath the banyan's wide canopy, settling into a hollow carved naturally by time and roots. The villagers formed a circle around her, flames flickering and casting dancing shadows. The priest began the incantations, words that spoke of release, renewal, and the binding of spirit to earth. As the ritual deepened, the night seemed to breathe with them. The wind softened, carrying the scent of jasmine and sandalwood. Leaves rustled gently, a lullaby whispered from branch to branch. Asha's eyes closed slowly, her body relaxing as if sinking into a long-awaited embrace. Just before sleep claimed her, she whispered clearly, almost inaudibly. Now, you can sleep too. The villagers held their breath. The tension that had wrapped the village like a shroud began to lift. One by one, the flames were lowered, the chants faded, and silence settled, an honest, tender silence that carried the promise of peace. In the days that followed, the village noticed subtle changes. The morning mist no longer seemed laden with dread but with possibility. The birds returned to sing in the trees. Streams that had run dry trickled again with fresh water. And Asha was gone, her spirit finally at rest, not bound by fear or unfinished business, but free within the breath of earth she had chosen. Berefber had reckoned with its past and found a way forward, guided by a woman who had walked between worlds and taught them that endings could be beginnings, if only one dared to listen. The first light of dawn spilled gently over Berefber, bathing the village in a soft, golden glow that seemed warmer than before. It was a morning like many others, yet beneath its calm surface, the village carried a new heartbeat, one steady, alive, and unafraid. It had been nearly a year since the night of the second burial beneath the ancient banyan tree, the breath of earth, where Asha had finally found rest. The memory of that evening was still vivid in the minds of many, not as a dark tale of fear and ghosts, but as a story of healing, of transformation. The village itself had changed, almost imperceptibly at first, but unmistakably as time passed. Doors remained unlocked, neighbors greeted each other with genuine smiles, and the old superstitions that once cast long shadows over Berefber had softened. The rigid boundaries between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown, had begun to blur, not in menace, but in acceptance. The banyan tree stood tall and proud at the edge of the village, its branches sprawling wide as if embracing the sky. Through the seasons, it had defied nature's ordinary course, even in the harshest winter months, when leaves withered and the earth seemed to hold its breath. The tree blossomed with brilliant white flowers, petals shimmering like stars against the cold. Children, with their unfiltered curiosity, often gathered beneath its shade, weaving new legends around Asha's story. Their voices carried through the village square as they retold tales of the woman who walked again, the kind-hearted spirit who had returned not to haunt but to teach. They spoke of her gentle footsteps that warmed the earth, her whispers that reminded the village to hold on to kindness and truth. Elder Shanta, now slower in movement but steady in spirit, would sit near the tree, watching the children play and listening to their stories with a soft smile. To her, Asha was no longer just a memory or a ghost but a symbol of courage, of the power of reckoning with one's past, and of the possibility of renewal. In the marketplace, villagers exchanged glances filled with quiet gratitude. Ravi, once the skeptic, had become a storyteller himself, recounting the events with a reverence that invited others to believe in the unseen bridges between worlds. The priest, humbled by the events that had challenged his faith and understanding, had begun to revise the temple's teachings. He spoke more of compassion than fear, more of listening than judgment. The ancient scrolls were no longer locked away but shared, their stories weaving new threads into the fabric of village life. On this particular morning, as the sun climbed higher, a gentle breeze stirred the air around the banyan tree. Petals drifted down like snowflakes, settling softly on the ground where Asha had been laid. It was as if the tree itself was breathing, alive with the memory of the woman who had walked between dusk and dawn. A young girl, no older than Mira had been, reached out to catch a falling petal. She smiled and whispered, "She's still here, isn't she?" Her mother nodded, eyes misty. "Yes, she is. In every sunrise, in every kind word, in the warmth beneath this tree." As the village stirred to life, the echoes of that first burial at dusk lingered like a distant song, a reminder not of endings but of what follows when the light returns. They had buried her at dusk, yes. But her sunrise still walked with them, always, forever.